The coat was still on the back of her chair. Margaret Del Vecchio had been sitting in the same chair for 22 minutes, and she had not once considered removing her coat. That was the tell, though she would not have admitted it to anyone who asked. The coat stayed on when she wasn't sure she was staying. The restaurant was the kind of place she had agreed to without looking up the address first, which was also unlike her. Côte Sud on King Street West, mid-range, good lighting. The kind of spot a mutual acquaintance might suggest when they were trying not to seem presumptuous. Her assistant Brienne had read her the name over the phone, and Margaret had said fine in the tone that meant she had already decided. This was the last time. She had said that before. 4 times in the past 3 years, she had sat down at a table like this one and told herself, last time. And each time she had gone home alone with the particular exhaustion of someone who had smiled for 2 hours and meant none of it. She was 51. She ran a mid-sized architectural consulting firm with offices in Toronto and Vancouver. She had rebuilt it from the ground up after her business partner of 11 years walked out with half her client list and, it turned out, a woman who had been her friend even longer. She did not think about that anymore, except when she was sitting in restaurants waiting for someone she had not chosen herself. The door opened. The man who walked in was not what she expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, she guessed, with the kind of unhurried movement that sometimes comes from confidence and sometimes comes from being tired in a very specific, practiced way. He wore a plain dark jacket over a gray shirt, no tie, boots that had been recently cleaned but were old enough to show it. He was not unattractive. He was also not trying. He scanned the room once, found her without hesitation, and walked over. "Margaret Del Vecchio," he said, not a question. "That's right," she said. "Callum Beresford." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without ceremony. No apology for the 3 minutes he was late, no comment on the restaurant or the weather or how hard it had been to find parking. He picked up the menu, glanced at it, and set it down. She waited. He said, "You're keeping your coat on." "I'm cold," she said. He nodded, as though this were a perfectly reasonable answer, and looked at her with the patient steadiness of someone who had heard a great many perfectly reasonable answers in his lifetime and had learned not to argue with any of them. The server came. They ordered drinks. Callum ordered water and coffee, which was not what men usually ordered when they were trying to impress someone, and Margaret filed that away without deciding yet what to do with it. "Theresa said you build things," he said. Theresa was the mutual acquaintance. Margaret had known her since university, which meant she trusted her judgment in most things and mistrusted it occasionally in this. "I consult on builds," Margaret said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" She looked at him. Most people, when she gave that answer, moved on quickly. They sensed the distinction was technical and assumed she was being pedantic. Callum Beresford did not look like he was assuming anything. He looked genuinely curious in the low-key way of someone who already knows a lot and is always quietly adding to it. "I come in when something's gone wrong," she said, "or when it's about to. The build is already designed, sometimes already started. My job is to find the fault before it becomes a catastrophe, structural, material, sometimes regulatory. Occasionally human." "Human," he said. "People make decisions under pressure that they wouldn't make otherwise. A contractor cuts corners because a deadline moved up. An engineer signs off on something she's not fully confident in because the client has money and a lawyer. I find those places." Callum was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that didn't feel like absence. It felt like he was actually thinking about what she'd said. "That sounds like a job that makes people uncomfortable," he said. "It does," she said. "I've learned to be fine with that." He nodded again. There was something in his expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not admiration exactly. More like recognition. The drinks arrived. She wrapped her hands around her wine glass and looked at him properly for the first time since he'd sat down. "Theresa said you work with wood," she said, because that was what Theresa had told her in the slightly apologetic tone she used when she thought Margaret might object to something. "I do," he said. "What kind of work?" "Furniture, mostly. Some restoration. Occasionally I'll take on a larger piece if the commission interests me." "Is that what you've always done?" He considered the question, not in the evasive way some men did when they were trying to redirect. He considered it honestly, the way you'd consider whether a thing was true. No, he said. I spent about 20 years in corporate real estate, development side, acquisitions. He said it without pride or apology. I stopped 12 years ago. She studied him. Why? Because I was good at it, he said, and I didn't like who I was when I was doing it. The table went quiet, not uncomfortably. Outside on King Street, a streetcar went past with the particular rattle of the old fleet, and somewhere behind them, someone laughed at something, and the sound was briefly warm in the room. Margaret took a sip of her wine. She became aware, without quite deciding to be aware of it, that she had not yet thought about leaving. Theresa mentioned you have a son, she said. Will. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just a minor opening. He's 19. He's studying environmental science in Guelph. You raised him alone? His mother and I separated when he was 7. She moved to Halifax eventually. Will chose to stay with me. He said it plainly, the way people say things they've made peace with, even when the peace wasn't easy to arrive at. I'm not sure he ever fully understood why she left. I'm not sure I did either for a long time. But you do now? He thought about it. We wanted different things out of the same life. That's usually what it is. Margaret looked at the table. There was a particular quality to sitting across from someone who answered questions like they meant it, and she had forgotten what it felt like. She had been in a relationship for 4 years that had ended 18 months ago, and the man she had been with had answered every personal question with a kind of cheerful vagueness she had eventually understood was not evasion but genuine lack of depth. He had been kind. He had also had nothing behind his eyes. You're not what I expected, she said, and then regretted saying it immediately, because it was a thing people said on dates, and she'd told herself she wasn't doing this like a date. What did you expect? Callum asked. I don't know, something easier to categorize. He looked at her steadily. Is that what you prefer? She didn't answer right away. The server came back and they ordered, almost as an afterthought, as though the food were beside the point, which it increasingly was. The trouble started, as it often did, with information that arrived at the wrong time. She had mentioned Callum to her colleague Isabeau on Thursday, in passing, and Isabeau had done what Isabeau always did when a name was mentioned. She had looked it up. She called Margaret on Friday morning while Margaret was walking to a site visit in the distillery district, and the tone in her voice was the slightly careful tone she used when she thought Margaret was about to be annoyed. Beresford, Isabeau said. Callum Beresford. What about him? You know who his father was, right? Margaret stopped walking. A cyclist came around her and threw a look over his shoulder. No, she said. Tell me Gerald Beresford. Commercial real estate. He died about 8 years ago and left a significant estate. Not enormous, but significant. A pause. I don't know exactly how much went to Callum. Could be nothing, could be a fair amount. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and felt something close inward in her chest. Margaret, I'm here. It might mean nothing. It might, she said. She walked the rest of the way to the site in silence, and she told herself she was being rational and not reactive. And she knew, with the particular self-knowledge of someone who has been deceived before, that she was lying to herself about which one she was doing. She met Callum for coffee on Saturday. They had made the plan before Friday morning, and she almost canceled. She didn't cancel because canceling felt like a decision she hadn't earned yet, and because she had a rule about not making permanent choices out of temporary discomfort. She sat down across from him in a small cafe on Ossington, the kind with mismatched chairs and handwritten specials on a chalkboard, and she looked at his plain jacket and his calm face and his old boots, and she thought, this is a man who may have inherited a considerable amount of money and is choosing to present as someone who did not. She didn't say any of that. She said, I need to ask you something. All right, Callum said. Your father, Gerald Beresford. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled the way a room settles when a window closes and the draft stops. Yes, he said. You inherited when he died. Some, he said. Not as much as people assumed. My father had strong opinions about inheritance and what it did to people. He structured things deliberately. He paused. I have a trust that pays out annually. It covers my workshop, partly. It's not a large amount relative to what people imagine. Why didn't you mention it? He looked at her directly. There was something in his eyes that was not defensiveness and not performance. It was just clarity, the uncomfortable kind. Because it's the third thing I've mentioned in a first conversation with someone, after my name and the fact that I work with wood. Where would you have put it? Margaret looked at her coffee cup. You've been treated as a resource before, she said. It was not a question. She'd meant to approach the subject differently, and instead she had said the actual thing. Yes, he said, so have I. They sat with that for a moment. The cafe was warm and smelled of cardamom and wet wool, and a child at the next table was explaining something to her father with tremendous seriousness, and her father was nodding with the same seriousness back. I'm not telling you there's nothing to be cautious about, Callum said eventually. I think caution is reasonable. I think it's especially reasonable when you've built something real and had people try to take pieces of it. He said it without looking away. But I want to be honest with you about what I actually am. I'm not hiding wealth. I'm also not particularly interested in yours. How would I know that, she asked. It came out more plainly than she intended. Not an accusation, a real question. You wouldn't, he said. Not yet. She thought about all the rules she had made for herself since the business partner, since the relationship before Callum and the one before that. She had made rules about timelines and transparency, and what she would and wouldn't accept. She had kept every one of them, and she was sitting in a cafe on Ossington on a Saturday morning, feeling the particular loneliness of someone who had protected herself so completely that she was beginning to wonder what exactly she was protecting. Tell me about the restoration work, she said. He blinked just slightly. Then he picked up his coffee. What do you want to know? Everything, she said. Start wherever you want. He started with a chest of drawers found at an estate sale in Brampton in his first year of doing this work. White oak, dovetail joints, something from the early 1900s that someone had painted over 3 times in colors that had nothing to do with each other. He'd spent 4 months stripping it down to find out what was underneath. He'd expected to find damage. What he found instead was that the original maker had carved a small figure of a bird on the inside of the bottom drawer, invisible unless you took the drawer all the way out. He'd never been able to identify the maker. The bird was a cedar waxwing, he thought, or close to one. He said he still had the chest in his workshop. He'd never sold it. Margaret listened. She was good at listening. It was part of her professional skill set, the ability to absorb detail and find the thing that mattered. But she was not always good at listening in this way, the way where you weren't looking for fault lines but just following someone because you wanted to know where they were going. She found herself asking about the dovetail joints. He answered for longer than she expected, and none of it was boring. At some point, she realized her coat was over the back of her chair, and she couldn't remember when she'd taken it off. They didn't call it anything for a long time. That was partly her preference, and partly she came to understand just how he moved through things, without forcing names onto them before the names were accurate. November became December. She had a complicated job in Mississauga that ran 3 weeks over schedule and required 2 additional site visits she hadn't planned for, and she canceled plans twice and he rescheduled without comment. He was teaching a joinery class on Thursday evenings at a community workshop space on DuPont, and sometimes she would walk over after her own long days and sit on a stool near the back and watch him work with people whose hands hadn't yet learned to be patient with the material. She noticed that he never made anyone feel slow. When a young woman in the Wednesday session misread the grain on a piece of maple and made a cut that couldn't be undone, Callum crouched down beside her and looked at the piece for a long moment and then said, "Here's what we do with that." He didn't tell her it was fine. He just moved forward. She told him that later, walking home through the first real snow of the season, the kind that came down quietly and made the city look briefly gentle. "You didn't tell her it was okay," Margaret said. "You just kept going." "It wasn't okay," he said. "The cut was wrong." But she already knew that. What she needed was to see that wrong wasn't the same as finished. Margaret looked at the snow on the sidewalk. "I wish someone had said that to me 20 years ago." He glanced at her. "What happened 20 years ago?" "I made a cut I thought I couldn't come back from." She pulled her scarf tighter. "It took me a long time to find out if I was right about that." "Were you?" "No," she said, "but the finding out was expensive." They walked the next block in silence that had a different quality than the silences at the beginning. She had learned, over these weeks, that his silences were almost always attentive. He was never gone when he went quiet. He was just listening to whatever had been said more carefully. "I keep waiting for this to get complicated," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. "It will," he said simply. "You say that like it's not a problem. I say it like it's just true." He stopped at a corner, looked at her. The snow was in his hair and on the shoulders of his jacket, and he hadn't bothered to brush it away. "I've been complicated before. So have you, I'd guess. It doesn't end things. It just tells you what you're actually dealing with." She looked at him for a moment. The streetlight caught the snow and the snow caught the light, and the whole street had the particular stillness of somewhere that is very cold and very quiet at the same time. "You're not what I expected," she said again, and this time she didn't regret it. He smiled then, the kind of smile she had been seeing in pieces. A corner of it here, a suggestion of it there. And this time it was complete, and it changed the way he looked entirely, and she understood all at once that he had been careful with it, not out of coldness but out of something closer to honesty. He hadn't wanted to give her the smile before he was sure it meant what it meant. "I know," he said. Will came home for the holidays in the second week of December, and Margaret met him by accident, which is to say she came by the workshop on a Saturday, to return a book Callum had lent her and found them both there. Will sitting on a workbench eating a sandwich, Callum at the bench doing something precise with a small hand plane. Will was taller than his father, and had his mother's coloring, she guessed, fairer with reddish hair, but he had Callum's way of measuring a room before he engaged with it. He looked at her without surprise or guardedness and said, "You're Margaret," not as a question, the way his father had said her name the first night. "That's right," she said. "He told me about the bird," Will said. She looked at Callum, who had put down the hand plane and was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who has carefully done nothing and is waiting to see what happens. "The cedar waxwing?" she asked. "He showed me that chest when I was about 8, Will said. "I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever seen, that someone would put something there just because it was theirs to put there." He thought about it. "I still think that." Margaret looked at the chest of drawers in the corner of the workshop, which she hadn't noticed until now. The wood was a warm, pale gold in the afternoon light. The bird on the inside of the bottom drawer was invisible from here as it was supposed to be, as it had always been. "So do I," she said. Christmas came and she drove to her sister's in Kingston and spent 4 days eating too much and letting her nephew explain his current understanding of black holes, which was detailed and not entirely accurate and completely wonderful. She called Callum on Christmas Eve, which was not something she had planned to do, and he answered on the second ring, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. His sister in Winnipeg, the joinery class, a piece he was building for a client in the annex that kept evolving because the client kept changing her mind, and Callum was, he said, increasingly convinced she didn't actually know what she wanted and that this was not something wood could fix. "Can anything fix it?" Margaret asked. "Time, maybe," he said. "Or someone asking her the right question. What's the right question?" "That's the part I haven't figured out yet." After she hung up, she sat by her sister's kitchen window for a while, looking at the snow on the lawn in Kingston, which was deeper and quieter than the snow in the city. And she thought about the rules she had made for herself and what exactly she had made them out of. Fear, mostly. The specific fear of someone who had been very badly wrong before and could not afford to be that badly wrong again. The rules had not been irrational. She'd needed them. She was no longer sure she still needed all of them. She told Brienne in January, not in the way she would have told her about a relationship. They were professional, though Brienne had worked for her for 9 years and the line had blurred at certain edges, but in the way of mentioning that she was not available on certain evenings and that this was a continuing situation. Brienne, who was 29 and observed everything, said, "The woodworker?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Good," Brienne said, and went back to the permit application she'd been reviewing. Margaret stood in the doorway of the office for a moment. "That's your whole response? You seem less tense," Brienne said, not looking up. "That's my whole response." The complicated part came in February, as he'd said it would, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated, which was the direction things usually came from in her experience. A man named Lionel Fitch, who was the managing director of a development firm she had done a consult for 3 years ago, reached out to offer her a contract that was large enough to be significant, and came with conditions she had never before been asked to accept. One of the conditions was that she would not be working with a contractor she'd flagged during the previous engagement. A contractor who had since, as best she could determine, made improvements to his practices, but who Lionel wanted sidelined regardless. A second condition was that she would report her preliminary findings to Lionel's team before filing the formal report. She sat with the offer for 2 days. The money was real. The conditions were not ones she could accept. She told Callum about it on a Thursday evening, sitting in his kitchen on Yarmouth Road while he made a soup that required more steps than she would have expected and smelled extraordinarily good. She laid out the situation as she would have laid it out to a colleague. Precise, chronological, without drama. When she finished, he stirred the soup and said nothing for a moment. "You've already decided," he said. "I have," she said. "I'm telling you because I wanted someone else to know it was a real choice and not an easy one." He looked at her over the pot. "It's not a question?" "No," she said. "I can't sign off on something I don't fully control. That's not pedantry. That's the whole job." "I know," he said. He turned back to the soup. "I wanted to hear you say it out loud. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the person who says that out loud is someone I want to know better." He said it without theater, the way he said most things. As a fact, he had arrived at honestly and saw no reason to complicate. She looked at the back of his head, the line of his shoulders, the way he moved around his own kitchen with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything else. She thought about the bottom drawer of a chest in the corner of a workshop, and a bird no one could see unless they looked. She thought about the cut you make that you think you can't come back from. She had come back. It had cost her. She was standing in a kitchen on Yarmouth Road on a Thursday in February, watching someone she trusted make soup, and she was not wearing her coat, and she had no plans to leave. "What do you want to do this weekend?" she asked. He turned around and looked at her, and the smile came the way it did now, complete, unhurried, meaning what it meant. "I was thinking the Christie Pitts market on Saturday," he said. "And then nothing in particular." "All right," she said. Outside, the February cold pressed against the kitchen windows, and inside the soup was nearly ready, and Margaret Del Vecchio sat in a chair that was not hers yet and felt, with the quiet surprise of someone who had genuinely not expected it, that she had stopped counting the ways this could go wrong.